The air clawed at my skin the moment I stepped out of the car, sharp and unforgiving, like 1,000 icy needles. Coldwater, Michigan was silent under its shroud of snow, but it was an unnatural sort of quiet. The kind that hummed in the back of your mind and made you glance over your shoulder, unsure of what you might find. I knew we weren't alone, even though logic insisted otherwise. Elliot Brooks was already ahead of me, his coat trailing behind him as he made his way toward the frozen expanse of Coldwater Lake. He moved with the precision and single-mindedness of a predator, his every step deliberate, his sharp gaze cutting through the haze of frost and gloom that hung over the town. I adjusted my scarf and trudged after him, boots crunching over hardened snow. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly. He didn't turn to look at me, but I caught the faint cloud of his breath curling in the air. "Feel what?" "The frostbite," I replied, my attempt at humor half-hearted at best. Elliot shook his head, motioning toward the lake without another word. His silence was unnerving, even for him. As his friend, I was used to his peculiarities. The way he sometimes got lost in his own thoughts, his tendency to speak in riddles that only made sense hours later, but today felt different. There was an edge to him, sharper than usual. The lake stretched out before us, vast and unyielding, its surface frozen solid and gleaming dully under the overcast sky. There was something about it, something I couldn't quite put into words, an almost palpable wrongness that tugged at my gut. The ice reflected the skeletal trees that lined the shore, their barren branches tangled like clawed fingers reaching for the heavens. The wind stirred the snow, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement beneath the ice. I stopped walking. "Elliot." He held up a hand, silencing me. Then, without warning, he crouched down and brushed away a thin layer of snow near the edge of the lake. I moved closer, my breath hitching when I saw what he'd uncovered. Deep gouges marred the frozen ground, jagged and deliberate, as though some great claw had slashed its way through the earth. The grooves curved inward, forming a crude pattern that reminded me of symbols I'd seen in old books and folklore illustrations. "What do you make of this?" Elliot asked, his voice unusually grim. I knelt beside him, running my gloved fingers along the gouges. The chill of the ice seeped through the leather and into my skin, sending a shiver up my spine. The grooves felt wrong, unnatural, almost predatory. "It looks familiar," I said hesitantly, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. "I've seen something like this before. A pattern, maybe. Something from Aztec mythology, or maybe one of those old European rituals. The ones tied to curses." Elliot glanced at me, his sharp eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Curses, heh?" I nodded. "Doesn't mean it's anything supernatural, though. Could just be a scare tactic, or some kind of marker. Or it could mean exactly what it looks like." His tone was calm, measured, but I could tell he wasn't ruling anything out. I stood and brushed snow off my knees, scanning the area for anything else out of the ordinary. Beyond the marks, there was nothing, just the endless expanse of snow and ice, stretching far into the distance. The eerie quiet gnawed at me, and I felt my pulse quicken despite the cold. "Sheriff Hayes said the sighting started here, didn't he?" Elliot asked, his gaze fixed on the lake. "Yeah, right by the shore." I glanced toward the cluster of trees on the far side of the lake, their twisted forms casting long shadows across the frozen surface. "He said people saw something moving under the ice, something big." Elliot's jaw tightened. "Then this is where we start." He turned back toward the car, his strides long and purposeful. I followed, keeping my distance and scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. The sense of being watched hadn't left me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking just out of sight. By the time we reached the sheriff's office, my nerves were frayed, though I tried not to let it show. The building was small and unimpressive, its brick exterior darkened by years of neglect. A single flickering light hung over the doorway, casting shadows that seemed to dance against the walls. Sheriff Hayes greeted us with a grunt, his expression as grim as the weather outside. He was a stout, middle-aged man with a face etched by decades of hard living and harder choices. His eyes, steel gray and tired, shifted between Elliot and me with wary curiosity. "Find anything?" he asked, leaning back in his chair and nursing a mug of coffee that smelled burnt. "Not enough," Elliot replied. "I need more context. When did the second sighting happen?" The sheriff sighed, setting his mug down with deliberate slowness. "Couple days ago. Jimmy Travis swears he saw something rise up out of the ice, big and dark, with eyes like fire. Poor kid's been holed up in his room ever since, scared to death. Can you take us there?" Elliot asked, his voice even but unyielding. Hayes hesitated, his gaze darting toward me as though searching for an explanation. Finally, he sighed again and pushed himself to his feet. "Fine, but you're not gonna like what you see." We followed him outside, the cold air biting at my cheeks once more. Snow began to fall in lazy spirals, catching the last traces of sunlight as the sky darkened. Hayes led us toward the lake, his boots crunching over the frozen ground. "Jimmy saw it over there," he said, pointing to a patch of disturbed snow near the edge of the ice. "Swears it looked right at him before disappearing. Said he felt like it was calling to him." Elliot crouched low again, his gloved hand brushing against the snow-covered ground. The marks were there, faint but unmistakable, more gouges, more patterns, just like the ones we'd seen earlier. "Same marks," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Miguel." I knelt beside him, the faint sense of recognition stirring in the back of my mind once more. "It's the same," I said. "Whatever's making these marks, it's not human." Elliot straightened, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. The shadows were long now, stretching across the lake like black tendrils. The wind stirred the snow again, and I thought I heard something, a low, guttural sound, too faint to be certain but enough to send a chill racing down my spine. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Hayes cleared his throat, his voice breaking the silence like a hammer on glass. "You fellas sure you want to keep poking around here?" he asked. "This town's got enough trouble as it is. No sense digging up more." Elliot didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the lake, his jaw tight and his eyes distant, as though he could see something the rest of us couldn't. Finally, he turned back to Hayes and nodded. "We're not leaving until we get to the bottom of this." And with that, he strode back toward the car, leaving me to follow in his wake, the weight of the marks, and their meaning, pressing heavy against my chest. As I glanced back at the lake one last time, I thought I saw something move beneath the ice, a flicker of shadow, a ripple in the stillness. But when I blinked, it was gone. The sheriff's warning echoed in my mind as Elliot drove us back to the motel. His usual stoic demeanor had settled into something even colder, a silence that filled the cramped car like the fog over the lake. I tried not to think about the marks or the stories Hayes had shared, but they lingered at the edges of my thoughts, insidious and unshakable. Elliot had the heater blasting, but the chill from the lake still clung to me, seeping into my bones. Every bump on the road sent tremors through the car, but he didn't slow down. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, the leather gloves stretching over knuckles as rigid as steel. I could see the faint reflection of his eyes in the rearview mirror, focused, calculating, and oddly distant. "You think Hayes knows more than he's letting on?" I asked, breaking the silence that had stretched thin between us. My voice felt too loud in the quiet. "He does," Elliot said, his gaze never leaving the road. "But it's not what he knows that concerns me. It's what he's afraid of." I leaned back against the seat, staring out at the darkened landscape. Snow flurries danced in the beam of the headlights, swirling like restless spirits. "And what's that?" Elliot hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "The lake." His answer hung between us, heavy and unspoken as the car rolled into the gravel lot outside our motel. The building was as nondescript as any small-town lodge, paint chipping off the wooden siding, a single neon sign buzzing faintly over the front office window. It was quiet, save for the occasional whistle of wind slipping through the cracks. I couldn't decide whether that was a comfort or a curse. Inside, our room was sparse but clean. Elliot wasted no time setting up his workspace. Maps, photos, and documents spread across the small table like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. He moved with purpose, his focus unwavering. I watched from the bed, trying to shake the unease that clung to me like a shadow. "Anything stand out to you so far?" I asked, pulling my notebook from my bag. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He traced his finger over one of the photographs, a close-up of the markings we'd seen by the lake, and frowned. "These aren't random. Someone, or something, put them here deliberately." I scribbled down his words, more out of habit than necessity. "So we're looking at intent. What kind of intent?" "That's what we need to figure out," Elliot replied. He leaned back in his chair, the faint creak of the wood breaking the silence. "But I don't think this is just fear or superstition. There's something real here, something dangerous." I nodded, though the weight of his words settled uncomfortably in my chest. The sheriff's stories replayed in my mind. Jimmy Travis locking himself in his room, the townsfolk whispering about shadows under the ice. It all felt like the beginning of something far darker than any of us wanted to acknowledge. Elliot reached for the journal Hayes had given us, flipping through its yellowed pages with the precision of a surgeon. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, the ink faded with age. As I watched him study the entries, I couldn't help but marvel at his ability to sift through the chaos of other people's fears and find the kernel of truth buried beneath. "This journal," he said finally, his voice low, "it's not just stories. It's instructions." "Instructions?" I asked, leaning forward. Elliot nodded. He pointed to a passage scrawled in the margin of one of the pages, a series of steps written in fragmented sentences. "This isn't someone recounting events. This is someone laying out a process, a ritual." I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. They were cryptic, fragmented, and unsettling in their specificity. References to the lake, to sacrifices, to something called the awakening. "What kind of ritual?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot's expression darkened. "The kind you don't walk away from." His answer sent a shiver down my spine, and I leaned back against the headboard, my notebook forgotten. The faint hum of the heater filled the room, but it did little to chase away the cold that had settled over us. "We need to find out more," Elliot said, closing the journal and setting it aside. About the cult, about these markings, about whatever's in that lake. And how do we do that? I asked. By talking to someone who knows the truth, Elliot replied. He stood and grabbed his coat, his movements deliberate. Come on, we're going back to Hayes. The drive back to the sheriff's office was uneventful, save for the growing weight of the storm gathering over Coldwater. The sky was dark, the snow falling heavier now, and the wind howled like a chorus of mourners. By the time we reached the office, the town felt abandoned, the streets empty and lifeless. Hayes was waiting for us, his expression as grim as the weather outside. He gestured for us to sit, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the journal in Elliot's hands. You found something, he said, though it wasn't a question. We found enough, Elliot replied, but not enough to know what we're dealing with. Hayes sighed, his shoulders slumping. You city folks don't know what you're getting yourselves into. Maybe not, Elliot said, his tone sharp. But that's why we're here. So help us. Tell us what you know. The sheriff hesitated, his gaze shifting between the two of us. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, You ever heard of the Coldwater cult? Elliot leaned forward. Enlighten us. Hayes rubbed a hand over his face, the lines in his skin deepening. Back in the 30s, there was a group, real small, real secretive, that started meeting by the lake. Said they were trying to tap into something older than the town, older than history. What did they do? Elliot asked. Rituals, Hayes replied, his voice heavy. Sacrifices. Animals at first, then people. The townsfolk put a stop to it eventually, or thought they did. But rumors started up again not long after. People said they saw shadows under the ice, heard voices on the wind. And now, here we are. Elliot's jaw tightened. And what do you think? Hayes hesitated, his gaze darkening. I think some things shouldn't be disturbed. Elliot didn't respond immediately. He stared at the journal in his hands, his mind working faster than I could follow. Finally, he stood, his expression unreadable. Let's go, he said. I followed him without question, though the unease gnawed at me with every step. The weight of Hayes's words hung heavy in the air, and as we stepped back out into the storm, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far darker than either of us could imagine. The lake waited for us, silent and still, its frozen surface gleaming under the dim light of the sky. And though I couldn't see anything moving beneath the ice, I felt it. Felt the presence Hayes had warned us about. Felt the echoes of something older than history, older than fear itself. Elliot didn't say a word, but I knew he felt it too. And in that moment, I realized, whatever we were searching for, it wasn't going to let us leave. The silence at Coldwater Lake was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an oppressive, almost tangible presence that pressed against my chest like heavy snowfall. The storm had eased just enough to let us return to the site Hayes had pointed out, but the air still felt thick, charged with a tension that made my pulse quicken despite the cold. Elliot walked ahead of me, his gaze fixed on the frozen expanse of the lake. He moved with purpose, his trench coat billowing slightly in the bitter wind, as if the air itself was trying to keep him from getting any closer to the edge. I followed, my boots crunching over the snow-covered ground, each step heavier than the last. Here, Elliot said, stopping abruptly. He crouched near the ice, brushing away the thin layer of snow that had settled over it. The markings beneath were faint but unmistakable, more grooves, etched into the frozen surface in that same deliberate, sinister pattern we'd seen before. I knelt beside him, my breath fogging in the frigid air. "They are spreading," I murmured, though the words barely felt like my own. The marks seemed almost alive, their jagged lines twisting and branching out like veins beneath the ice. Elliot nodded, his gloved hand tracing the edges of one of the larger symbols. "Someone's continuing the ritual," he said, his tone measured but grim. "Or something is." The weight of his words settled over me, and I couldn't shake the unease that had been growing since we first arrived in Coldwater. The markings weren't just signs. They were messages, warnings, or perhaps even calls to something deeper, something hidden beneath the ice. "What do you think they mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, as though listening for something just out of reach, then stood and began pacing along the shoreline. His movements were deliberate, his gaze shifting between the ice and the darkened trees that lined the lake. He was searching for something, though I couldn't tell whether it was answers or more questions. I stayed where I was, staring down at the markings and tracing their patterns in my mind. They reminded me of the illustrations I'd seen in old folktale books, symbols of protection, curses, and summoning. But these felt darker, older, as though they belonged to a time before language had names for such things. Elliot's voice broke the silence. "There's something beneath the ice," he said, his gaze fixed on a faint ripple in the surface. "Something alive." I frowned, following his gaze. The ice was still, save for the occasional shimmer of light reflecting off its surface. But as I watched, I thought I saw movement, a shadow, shifting just beneath the frozen barrier. Could it be an animal? I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Not like any animal I've seen," Elliot replied. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Whatever's down there isn't natural." I stood, brushing snow off my knees and glancing toward the trees. The shadows stretched long and narrow across the ground, their twisted forms casting eerie shapes against the snow. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement between the branches, but when I blinked, it was gone. Elliot didn't seem to notice. He was already moving toward the edge of the lake, his steps deliberate despite the slippery ground. "We need to find out more about these markings," he said, almost to himself. "They're the key to whatever's happening here." "And how do we do that?" I asked, trying to keep pace with him. Elliot stopped, turning to face me. "We start with Hayes. He knows more than he's letting on." The drive back to the sheriff's office was uneventful, but the tension between us was palpable. Elliot's focus had sharpened into something almost dangerous, and I could tell he was piecing together fragments of the puzzle in his mind, even if he wasn't ready to share them yet. Hayes greeted us with the same grim expression as before, though his eyes widened slightly when Elliot placed the journal on the desk between them. "We need answers," Elliot said, his tone sharp. "No more half-truths." The sheriff frowned, his gaze shifting between us. "I already told you everything I know." "Then tell us what you don't know," Elliot countered. "Who started the cult? What were they trying to do?" Hayes hesitated, his expression darkening. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It started back in the 30s, he said, his voice heavy. "A group of locals, farmers, fishermen, people you wouldn't look twice at, started meeting by the lake. Said they were trying to awaken something older than history. And they performed rituals? Elliot asked. Hayes nodded. Sacrifices. Animals at first, then people. The town put a stop to it, but there were rumors that some of them survived. Said they kept going, in secret. And now? Elliot pressed. Hayes shook his head. Now, I don't know. But if people are seeing things again, it means someone's continuing what the cult started. Elliot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Who? The sheriff hesitated, then said, Ellie Harper. I felt my pulse quicken at the name. The reclusive librarian we'd spoken to earlier. She'd seemed nervous, guarded, as though she knew more than she was willing to share. Elliot didn't wait for Hayes to elaborate. He stood, grabbing his coat and motioning for me to follow. Let's go, he said. The drive to Ellie Harper's house was tense, the storm growing heavier with each passing mile. Snow whipped against the windshield, obscuring the road and casting eerie shadows against the glass. By the time we reached her house, a small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of town, the storm had become a full-blown blizzard. Elliot knocked sharply on the door, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, and Ellie Harper appeared in the dim light. What do you want? She asked, her voice trembling. Answers, Elliot said. About the cult. About the lake. About whatever's happening in this town. Ellie hesitated, her gaze darting between us. Finally, she stepped aside, motioning for us to enter. The cabin was small and cluttered, filled with stacks of books and papers that seemed to spill over every surface. The air was thick with the scent of old ink and musty paper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding. Ellie sat down at a small table, her hands trembling as she reached for a worn notebook. The cult, she began, her voice barely audible, wasn't just trying to awaken something. They were trying to control it, to use it. Use it for what? Elliot asked. Power, Ellie replied. They believed the lake held something ancient, something powerful, and they thought they could harness that power for themselves. And the markings? Elliot pressed. Ellie hesitated, then said, they're part of the ritual, a way to communicate with whatever's beneath the ice. I felt my pulse quicken at her words, the unease that had been growing since we first arrived in Coldwater now sharpening into something far more visceral. Whatever the cult had started, it wasn't just about fear or superstition. It was about something real, something dangerous. Elliot didn't respond immediately. He stared at Ellie, his mind working faster than I could follow. Finally, he stood, his expression unreadable. We need to go back to the lake, he said. Ellie's eyes widened. You can't, she said, her voice trembling. It's not safe. Not anymore. Elliot didn't answer. He was already moving toward the door, his steps deliberate despite the storm raging outside. And as I followed him into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far darker than any of us could imagine. The drive through Coldwater's winding backroads was a harsh reminder of the town's isolation. Snow pounded against the windshield, reducing visibility to a blurred smear of white. It felt as though the storm had conspired to keep us from reaching our destination, the old cabin's haze had marked on the map. Elliot navigated with his usual unerring focus, though I could tell by the tension in his shoulders that even he wasn't entirely immune to the weight of the storm or the secrets it concealed. I kept quiet as he drove, my eyes scanning the snow-covered trees that flanked us on either side. They seemed taller than they had in the daylight, their branches twisted and claw-like as they swayed in the wind. Every so often, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of shadow against the pale backdrop, but it was always gone before I could look closer. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the edge of the woods, where the gravel road ended and the trail Hayes had mentioned began. Elliot parked the car and grabbed his bag from the back seat, his movements brisk and purposeful. "Let's go," he said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. I followed him out into the storm, pulling my scarf tighter around my neck as the cold bit at my skin. The trail was barely visible, buried under layers of snow that seemed determined to erase it from existence. Elliot led the way, his boots crunching over the frozen ground as he carved a path through the white abyss. The cabins appeared suddenly, their dark silhouettes emerging from the storm like ghosts. There were 3 of them, huddled together in a clearing near the edge of the lake. The buildings were old and weathered, their wooden walls warped and splintered from years of exposure to the elements. The windows were dark, their glass cracked and coated in frost. Elliot didn't hesitate. He approached the nearest cabin and pushed the door open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. I followed him inside, my heart pounding despite the cold. The air inside the cabin was heavy, thick with the scent of rot and mildew. The floorboards creaked beneath our boots, each step echoing through the empty space like a warning. The room was bare save for a few scattered objects, an overturned chair, a broken table, and a fireplace filled with ash. Elliot's flashlight swept across the walls, revealing carvings etched into the wood. The markings were crude but deliberate, their jagged lines twisting and overlapping like the ones we'd seen on the ice. I ran my fingers over them, the texture rough and uneven against my gloves. "They match," I said, my voice barely audible. Elliot nodded, his flashlight settling on a section of the wall where the carvings were deepest. "This isn't just random," he murmured. "Someone spent time here." "Do you think it was the cult?" I asked. "Most likely," Elliot replied. "But this feels older, like it was here before the rituals began." I frowned, my mind racing to connect the pieces. If the markings were older than the cult, then what did that mean for the ritual? Were the cultists following instructions, or had they stumbled onto something they didn't fully understand? Elliot motioned for me to follow him deeper into the cabin, where another door led to a smaller room. Inside, we found more markings, along with a pile of broken furniture and a wooden chest half buried under debris. Elliot crouched and pulled the chest free, his movements careful despite the urgency in his expression. The chest creaked as he opened it, revealing a collection of objects that seemed as out of place in cold water as the storm raging outside. There were books, their covers worn and faded, along with jars filled with strange powders and fragments of bone. Elliot picked up one of the books and flipped through its pages, his flashlight casting shadows over the text. "Ritual instructions," he said, his voice grim. "Bindings, summoning, offerings, it's all here." I stepped closer, my gaze drifting to the jars. The contents were unsettling, their origins unclear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were more than just remnants of superstition. "What kind of offerings?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "Blood," Elliot replied, closing the book and setting it aside. "Animal at first, then human. Each one meant to strengthen the connection." I felt my stomach churn, but I forced myself to focus. And the summoning, what were they trying to bring? Elliot hesitated, his gaze lingering on one of the jars. Something older than the lake, older than us. Before I could respond, The sound of footsteps outside the cabin sent a jolt through my chest. Elliot's flashlight snapped toward the door, his hand reaching instinctively for the knife he kept at his belt. I moved closer to him, my pulse quickening as the footsteps grew louder. The door creaked open, and for a moment, I was certain we were about to face whatever had been watching us since we arrived in Coldwater. But instead, a figure stepped into the room. A man, tall and wiry, with a face weathered by years of hardship. He stared at us, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough and gravelly. "And why is that?" Elliot asked, his tone sharp. The man hesitated, his gaze shifting between us. "Because you're messing with something you don't understand." Elliot didn't flinch. "Then help us understand." The man sighed, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the storm had finally caught up to him. "The lake doesn't forgive," he said. "It takes, and it doesn't give back." "What does it take?" Elliot pressed. "Everything," the man replied. "Your life, your soul, whatever you offer it." The cult learned that the hard way. "And what did they summon?" Elliot asked. The man hesitated, then said, "Something hungry." His answer sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were closer to the truth than we'd ever been. Whatever the cult had awakened, it wasn't just a presence or a shadow. It was a predator, waiting beneath the ice. Elliot thanked the man and motioned for me to follow him outside. The storm had grown heavier, the wind whipping against our faces as we made our way back to the car. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see the figure lurking behind us, but the cabins remained still and silent, their dark windows reflecting the storm. As Elliot started the car and pulled onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The marks on the walls, the jars in the chest, the man's warning, they all pointed to something far darker than I could comprehend. And as the lake disappeared into the distance, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was beneath the ice wasn't done waiting. The storm had quieted to a relentless murmur by the time we returned to the lake. The snow no longer fell in violent flurries, but rather in a slow, silent drift that blanketed everything in an oppressive whiteness. The night had deepened, and the world felt empty, as though Coldwater had been erased off the map, leaving only this frozen wasteland and the uneasy shadows it harbored. Elliot stepped out of the car first, his movements calculated despite the biting cold. He adjusted his coat, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness before him. Even in the dim light of our flashlights, I could see the tension in his stance, the quiet determination in the way he held himself. It was the look of a man walking into a battlefield he didn't entirely understand. I hesitated, the heavy silence pressing down on me as I followed him out into the night. My boots crunched over the snow, the sound too loud in the stillness. The lake stretched out before us, its frozen surface glinting faintly under the pale glow of the moon. But there was something wrong about it, something unnatural in the way it reflected the light. Too smooth, too perfect, like a mirror that refused to reveal what lay beneath. Elliot knelt at the edge of the ice, brushing away a layer of snow to reveal another set of markings. They were fresh, the grooves cutting sharply into the frozen surface, their jagged lines twisting and overlapping in a way that made my stomach churn. I watched as he traced the edges with his gloved fingers, his expression grim. "They're accelerating," he said, his voice low. "Whoever's doing this, they're not wasting any time." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in my chest like a stone. "Do you think it's someone from the town?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Elliot straightened, his gaze shifting to the dark line of trees that bordered the lake. "I think we're dealing with more than one person," he said. "And I think they've been planning this for a long time." The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I glanced around, half expecting to see movement in the shadows, but the forest remained still, its twisted branches swaying gently in the wind. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He was staring out at the lake, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped onto the ice. "Elliot," I called after him, my heart racing as I watched him test the frozen surface with deliberate steps. "What are you doing?" "Looking for answers," he said simply. He moved cautiously, his flashlight sweeping across the ice as he walked further out. I hesitated for a moment, then followed, my own steps unsteady as the frozen surface groaned faintly beneath my weight. The air grew colder the further we ventured from the shore, and the silence deepened into something almost suffocating. I kept my eyes on Elliot, his figure a dark silhouette against the endless white. He stopped suddenly, kneeling once more to inspect the ice. "Here," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. He pointed to a spot where the markings converged, forming a crude, spiraling pattern that seemed to pulse faintly under the beam of his flashlight. I knelt beside him, the unease in my chest tightening into something closer to fear. "What does it mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "It's a focal point," Elliot said, "the center of the ritual." "And what happens here?" He looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Everything." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps shattered the silence. They were faint at first, barely discernible against the whisper of the wind, but they grew louder, closer, until they echoed across the ice like gunshots. I turned sharply, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing, only the endless expanse of snow and ice, stretching out into oblivion. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Elliot nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. "We're not alone." The footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment, the silence was more deafening than the sound had been. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, flickering at the edge of the lake, too quick and too fluid to belong to anything human. "Over there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot followed my gaze, his flashlight sweeping across the ice, but the shadow was already gone. We stood there in silence, our breaths fogging in the frigid air. The shadows seemed to shift around us, their forms fluid and unnatural, as though the darkness itself had come alive. My pulse quickened, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight, its beam shaking slightly as I tried to steady my hands. "Stay close," Elliot said, his voice calm but firm. He began moving toward the shore, his steps quick and deliberate. I followed, my own movements clumsy and unsteady as the ice creaked ominously beneath me. The shore felt impossibly far away, the line of trees barely visible through the swirling snow. I kept my eyes on Elliot, his figure the only thing grounding me in the endless whiteness. But as we moved, the shadows grew bolder, their movements more deliberate, more purposeful. By the time we reached the edge of the lake, my heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Elliot stopped abruptly, his flashlight fixed on the tree line. There, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its form shrouded in darkness. For a moment, it didn't move, its silhouette blending almost seamlessly with the twisted branches behind it. Then, slowly, it turned toward us. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were unlike anything I had ever seen. They glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, their light cutting through the shadows and sending a jolt of fear straight to my core. Elliot didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his knife glinting faintly in the dim light. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp and unwavering. The figure didn't respond. It stood there for a moment longer, its glowing eyes fixed on us, then turned and vanished into the trees. Elliot lowered his knife, his jaw tight. "We need to move," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. We made our way back to the car in silence, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us like a physical force. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes. Their faint glow still burned into my mind like a brand. Whatever was happening in Coldwater, it was far darker and far more dangerous than either of us had anticipated. As we drove away from the lake, I glanced back at the trees, half expecting to see the figure watching us from the shadows. But the forest remained still, its twisted branches swaying gently in the wind. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. The drive back into town was oppressive. The storm had ebbed to a whisper, leaving behind a heavy stillness that clung to the air like damp cloth. Even the glow of streetlights failed to bring any sense of relief. Their pale, flickering beams only deepened the shadows between buildings and stretched their eerie silhouettes. I glanced at Elliot, his face sharp and unreadable in the light from the dashboard. He gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his knuckles white against the black leather gloves. Whatever conclusion he'd drawn from what we saw at the lake was settling over him like a storm cloud. I wanted to say something, break the silence that hung between us, but my throat felt tight. Every word I considered stuck somewhere deep, tangled up with the image of those glowing eyes in the trees, the shadow slipping across the ice. My pulse quickened as I remembered the faint rumble that had seemed to echo beneath the lake, too subtle to notice at first but unmistakable the longer I focused on it. A predator waiting. Elliot broke the silence before I could find my voice. "We're going to see Ellie Harper again." It wasn't a suggestion. His tone left no room for debate, and I didn't offer any. He was already navigating through the winding streets, heading toward the librarian's cabin on the outskirts of town. I tightened my scarf, the weight of the chest and markings from the cabin still vivid in my mind. The gravel crackled under the car's tires as we pulled into Ellie's driveway. The cabin sat in a blanket of darkness, its windows black and lifeless, the faint glow of moonlight hardly enough to illuminate its edges. I stepped out of the car into the cold, the crunch of snow beneath my boots feeling deafening in the stillness. Elliot knocked sharply on the door, his gloved fist rattling the wood with deliberate force. The sound seemed to linger in the air, as though even the noise refused to leave this place. I shifted uncomfortably, my breath fogging in the light from the porch. The door opened a crack, revealing Ellie's pale face framed by dark, unkempt curls. Her eyes were wide with panic, darting between Elliot and me. "You shouldn't be here," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "It's too dangerous now." "We don't have time for warnings," Elliot replied, his tone clipped. "We need answers. About the lake, about the markings, about the ritual." Ellie hesitated, her fingers tightening on the edge of the door. "I can't," she began, but Elliot cut her off. "Don't waste time. You're involved, whether you like it or not. So, start talking." The bluntness of his words surprised even me, but it had the desired effect. Ellie sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping, and stepped aside, motioning for us to enter. The interior of the cabin was as cluttered as before, books stacked haphazardly, papers strewn across the table, artifacts that seemed plucked from history itself crammed into every corner. The air was thick with the scent of musty paper and something faintly metallic. Ellie sat at the table, her trembling hands resting on its scarred surface, her eyes avoiding ours as though she couldn't bear the weight of our questions. Elliot remained standing, his presence towering and deliberate. "What do the markings mean?" he asked. "The spirals, the symbols, we've seen them at the lake, at the cabins. They aren't just decoration. They're instructions." Ellie nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. They're part of the ritual," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "A way to connect to whatever's beneath the ice." "And what's beneath the ice?" Elliot pressed. Ellie's gaze flicked up to meet his, her expression tight with fear. "It's older than the town, older than the lake itself. It's not supposed to be awake." I felt my pulse quicken at her words, the weight of them pressing down on me like a physical force. "But the cult woke it," I said, "decades ago." Ellie shook her head. "They tried. They didn't succeed. But now, someone's continuing what they started." Elliot narrowed his eyes. "Who?" Ellie hesitated, her fingers twisting in the hem of her sweater. "The sheriff," she began, but stopped herself, her gaze darting to the door as though she feared someone might burst in at any moment. "What about him?" Elliot asked sharply. "He's part of it," Ellie said finally, her voice trembling. "He's been protecting the ritual. The sightings, the disappearances, it's all been covered up." Elliot straightened, his jaw tight. "And why would he do that?" Ellie hesitated again, her gaze shifting to me as though she expected me to understand. "Because he thinks it's the only way to save the town." Her answer hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I couldn't comprehend it. The idea that someone would protect something so dangerous, so wrong, in the name of salvation. My chest tightened as I thought about Hayes, his grim demeanor, his warnings about the lake. "You're saying Hayes is keeping this going," Elliot said, his tone sharp. "That he's deliberately continuing the ritual." Ellie nodded, her hands trembling. "I don't think he wants to. I think he's scared of what happens if it isn't finished." "What happens?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ellie didn't answer. She stared at the table, her expression tight with fear and guilt. And though I wanted to push her for more, I couldn't bring myself to break the silence. Elliot didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, his movements deliberate. "Let's go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I followed him out into the cold, the weight of Ellie's words settling heavy in my chest. The town felt even darker now, its twisted shadows clawing at the edges of my mind as we drove back toward the sheriff's office. When we arrived, Hayes was waiting for us, his face sharp and grim in the faint glow of the desk lamp. He didn't seem surprised to see us, though his eyes narrowed slightly as Elliot placed the journal on the desk. "We need to talk," Elliot said, his voice firm. Hayes sighed, his gaze darting between us. "I already told you everything I know," he said. "No," Elliot replied sharply. "You told us everything you want us to know." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're in over your heads," he said finally. "Then help us understand," Elliot countered. "Tell us why you're protecting this." Hayes didn't answer immediately. He stared at the journal, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "The lake doesn't forgive," he said. "It doesn't give back. But if the ritual's finished, if the connection's complete, maybe it will let us go." His answer sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I couldn't comprehend the idea of bargaining with something so dangerous, so predatory. But Hayes seemed resolute, his fear buried beneath a layer of grim determination. Elliot didn't respond immediately. He stared at Hayes, his expression sharp and unreadable. Then, without a word, he grabbed the journal and motioned for me to follow him. The weight of what we'd learned pressed down on us as we stepped out into the night, the shadows stretching long and narrow against the snow-covered ground. And though the silence was oppressive, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we made our way back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching us from the darkness. But the town remained still, its twisted shadows swaying gently in the wind. And yet, I knew the lake was waiting. The sheriff's office was eerily quiet as we left, the sound of the heavy wooden door creaking shut behind us echoing into the cold night. I could feel the weight of Hayes's words pressing down on my shoulders like invisible hands, his cryptic reasoning for keeping the ritual going clinging to my thoughts like frost to glass. The car was parked under a dying street lamp that flickered weakly, and the whole street seemed to hold its breath as we climbed in. Elliot gripped the wheel tightly as he started the engine, his movements efficient but tense. The soft rumble of the car felt intrusive in the dead silence of Coldwater, and I found myself glancing back at the empty buildings lining the street, half expecting to see something watching us. Every shadow seemed longer now, every corner darker. The town felt alive in the worst possible way. "We need to end this tonight," Elliot said, breaking the silence as he turned onto a narrow road that led out of town. His voice was low, almost as if he didn't want the words to carry too far. "How?" I asked, though the question tasted bitter as it left my lips. If Hayes is right, if finishing the ritual is the only way, what does that even mean? And who's carrying it out? Elliot didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained on the road, his jaw tight. Someone in this town knows what they're doing, and they're not stopping. We have to find them before they finish. His words left a hollow pit in my stomach, but I nodded. The road ahead was shrouded in darkness, the trees on either side arching over us like skeletal fingers. The storm had eased into a gentle snowfall, but the cold felt sharper now, more personal. We were heading back to the lake. Of course we were. Every lead, every clue, every horrifying revelation pointed us back to that cursed expanse of ice. The air seemed to grow heavier as we drew closer, and when the lake finally came into view, my chest tightened. It was still and silent, its frozen surface gleaming faintly under the pale light of the moon. But the stillness felt wrong, like the calm before an explosion. Elliot parked the car at the edge of the tree line, cutting the engine without a word. He grabbed his bag from the back seat, checking its contents with the same meticulousness I'd seen him apply to crime scenes and puzzles. I followed his lead, steeling myself as I pulled on my gloves and adjusted my scarf. The air bit at my face the moment I stepped out, sharp and unforgiving. The path to the lake was almost entirely buried under snow, but we didn't need it. The lake called to us, its presence unmistakable even in the darkness. Elliot moved ahead of me, his flashlight cutting through the gloom as we made our way toward the shore. The ice stretched out before us, vast and unyielding, and I couldn't help but feel like it was watching us. "Do you hear that?" Elliot asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. I froze, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. At first, There was nothing, just the soft whisper of the wind and the distant rustle of branches. But then, faintly, I heard it. A low, rhythmic hum, almost like a chant, carried on the wind from somewhere across the lake. "Over there," Elliot said, his voice barely audible as he pointed to the far side of the lake. His flashlight beam swept across the ice, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement, shadows flickering just beyond the reach of the light. My pulse quickened as we stepped onto the ice, the cold seeping through the soles of my boots with each step. The humming grew louder as we approached, and I could feel the vibrations in my chest, a deep and resonant sound that seemed to echo within me. Elliot moved with purpose, his focus unshakable, while I struggled to keep my footing on the slick surface. As we neared the source of the sound, the shadows came into view. There were 3 figures standing in a circle near the center of the lake, their forms shrouded in heavy cloaks that billowed faintly in the wind. They were chanting, their voices low and guttural, and the air around them seemed to ripple with an almost tangible energy. Elliot held up a hand, signaling for me to stop. He crouched low, his flashlight off, and I followed suit, my breath hitching as I watched the scene before us. The figures didn't seem to notice us, their focus entirely on whatever they were summoning. Between them, etched into the ice, was a massive spiral, larger and more intricate than any of the markings we'd seen before. It pulsed faintly, a sickly red glow emanating from its center, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread just looking at it. "They are finishing the ritual," Elliot whispered, his voice tight with urgency. He reached into his bag, pulling out a set of flares and a small bundle of what I could only assume were explosives. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Breaking the connection," Elliot said. "If we can disrupt the spiral, we can stop whatever they're trying to summon." I nodded, though the thought of stepping closer to that unholy light made my stomach churn. Elliot handed me a flare, his expression grim but resolute. "Stay close," he said. We moved carefully, the ice groaning beneath our weight with each step. The figures continued their chant, oblivious to our approach, and I couldn't help but feel like the lake itself was watching us, its frozen surface a thin barrier between us and something far more dangerous. When we were close enough to the spiral, Elliot lit his flare, the sudden burst of light cutting through the darkness like a blade. The figures froze, their chanting ceasing abruptly as they turned to face us. Their faces were obscured by their hoods, but I could feel their gaze, sharp and malevolent, burning into us. "Now!" Elliot shouted, tossing the flare onto the spiral. The red glow intensified as the flare landed, the markings writhing like living things as the light consumed them. One of the figures lunged toward us, but Elliot was faster. He swung his flashlight, connecting with the figure's head with a sickening crack, and they crumpled to the ice. The other 2 figures hesitated, their movements uncertain as the spiral began to fracture. "Move!" Elliot barked, grabbing my arm and pulling me back toward the shore. The ice beneath us groaned louder, cracks spiderwebbing out from the spiral as the glow dimmed. The humming had become a deafening roar, and I could feel the vibrations in my teeth as we ran. The ground gave way just as we reached the edge of the lake, a massive fissure splitting the ice in 2. I turned back in time to see the spiral collapse, the figures consumed by the darkness as the frozen surface caved in. A low, guttural roar echoed from beneath the ice, and I felt a wave of cold air rush past me, sharp and biting. We didn't stop running until we reached the tree line, the forest swallowing us in its shadows. My lungs burned with each breath, and my hands trembled as I clung to a tree for support. Elliot stood beside me, his expression grim but unshaken. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The lake was silent now, its surface dark and still, but I could feel its presence, a heavy, oppressive weight that lingered in the air. "We're not done," Elliot said finally, his voice low. "Not yet." I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. The lake had taken something tonight, but it hadn't given anything back. And I knew it wouldn't let us go so easily. The air outside the cabin was suffocating despite the freezing temperature. Every breath I took felt heavier, as if the cold itself carried the weight of the events that had unfolded by the lake. My hands trembled slightly, more from the adrenaline still coursing through my veins than the frost biting at my skin. Elliot walked ahead of me, his flashlight casting fleeting beams of light across the snow-draped forest floor. His silence was deafening, and I knew better than to try to break it. The path back to the car felt longer this time, every sound amplified in the stillness of the woods. The faint crunch of snow beneath our boots was a reminder of just how isolated we were out here, surrounded by a darkness that seemed almost alive. Somewhere behind us, the lake loomed, a vast, icy expanse that now felt more like a predator watching its prey than a frozen piece of nature. As we neared the car, Elliot finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "There's more to this," he said. His words hung in the air like frost, and I could hear the weight behind them. The spiral, the figures, the lake, they're all connected, but we're missing something. "Something like what?" I asked, my voice breaking through the tension like a fragile thread. Elliot didn't answer right away. He unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, staring out at the road ahead as though searching for answers in the dark. I climbed in beside him, the warmth of the car heater a stark contrast to the chill that clung to me. After a long silence, he finally said, "Motive. Intent. Whoever's orchestrating this, they're not just finishing a ritual. There's a reason they're doing this now." I frowned, processing his words. "You think this is about more than waking whatever's under the lake?" Elliot nodded, his gaze still fixed on the road. "Everything points to a bigger plan. The question is, whose plan is it, and how far are they willing to go?" The car rumbled to life as he turned the key, the engine's hum breaking the oppressive silence. He shifted into gear and began driving, the tires crunching over the snow-covered road. The town of Coldwater lay ahead, its faint glow visible through the trees, but it felt like we were heading toward the unknown rather than the familiar. As we reached the outskirts of town, Elliot slowed the car, his eyes narrowing. "We're not going back to the motel," he said, his tone decisive. "We need more information. Someone in this town knows the truth." I glanced at him, my unease growing. "And who do you think that is?" "Ellie Harper," he replied without hesitation. "She knows more than she's telling us." The thought of confronting Ellie again filled me with a mix of dread and determination. She'd been elusive, guarded, but there was no denying the fear in her eyes when she spoke of the lake and its secrets. If anyone could shed light on what was happening, it was her. We reached Ellie's cabin just as the snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting down like whispers from the sky. The cabin was dark, its windows lifeless, and for a moment, I thought she wasn't home. But as Elliot knocked sharply on the door, I saw the faint flicker of movement behind the curtains. "Ellie," Elliot called out, his voice firm but not unkind. "We need to talk." The door creaked open a few inches, and Ellie's face appeared in the gap. She looked worse than before, her eyes hollow, her skin pale, and her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the door. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Answers, Elliot said simply. You know what's happening here. You know what the lake is, and what's under it. Ellie hesitated, her gaze darting between us. Finally, she opened the door wider, motioning for us to come inside. The cabin was as cluttered as ever, the stacks of books and papers creating a maze of knowledge and chaos. The air was thick with the scent of old ink and dust, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into a place caught between worlds. Ellie sat down at the table, her hands still trembling as she reached for a worn notebook. You don't understand what you're asking, she said, her voice laced with desperation. This isn't something you can stop. Elliot leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Try me. Ellie sighed, her shoulders slumping. The lake isn't just a lake, she began, her voice trembling. It's a barrier, a seal, keeping something ancient and powerful trapped beneath it. The ritual is the only thing maintaining that seal, but it's fragile. If it's disrupted, if the connection is broken. She trailed off, her words hanging in the air like a knife waiting to fall. What happens if it's broken? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ellie's eyes met mine, and I saw a depth of fear there that I hadn't thought possible. It gets out, she said simply, and it doesn't stop. The weight of her words settled over us like a shroud, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. Elliot didn't flinch, his focus sharper than ever. Who's continuing the ritual? He asked. And why? Ellie hesitated, her hands tightening around the edges of the notebook. I don't know, she admitted. But whoever it is, they're not trying to maintain the seal. They're trying to destroy it. Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I struggled to process the implications. Someone in Coldwater was deliberately trying to unleash whatever was beneath the lake. Something ancient, powerful, and deadly. Why now? Elliot asked. Why after all these years? Ellie shook her head, her gaze distant. I don't know, she said, but the signs are everywhere. The lake is waking up, and if it gets out. She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't have to. The weight of her fear was enough. Elliot stood, his movements deliberate. We need to get back to the lake, he said. If we can stop the ritual before it's complete, we can stop this. Ellie looked at him, her eyes wide with panic. You don't understand, she said. The lake doesn't forgive. It doesn't care who lives or dies. It only cares about being fed. Elliot didn't waver. He turned to me, his expression resolute. Let's go. I followed him out into the cold, the weight of Ellie's words pressing down on me with every step. The snow was falling heavier now, and the wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. The lake waited for us, its frozen surface gleaming in the pale light. And as we stepped onto the ice once more, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into the jaws of something far greater than we could comprehend. The wind clawed at my face as we stepped onto the frozen lake, its bitter chill slicing through the layers of my scarf and coat as if they weren't even there. The moon hung high in the sky, pale and distant, casting an eerie glow over the jagged cracks spiderwebbing across the ice. The silence was deafening, the kind that pressed into your ears and made your pulse quicken for reasons you couldn't fully grasp. Elliot moved ahead of me, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. His steps were deliberate, measured, the weight of his resolve etched into every movement. I followed, every crunch of snow beneath my boots feeling like an unwelcome intrusion on the eerie stillness surrounding us. The spiral had returned. I could see it from yards away, glowing faintly beneath the fractured surface of the ice, its crimson light pulsing like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient. There were figures gathered around it again, their cloaks billowing faintly in the wind. They moved in a strange rhythm, their hands raised toward the sky as guttural chants spilled from their lips. The sound sent shivers racing down my spine. Elliot didn't falter. He motioned for me to stop, then crouched low, his focus unwavering. "They are finishing it," he murmured, his voice low but sharp. "If we don't stop them now." I didn't let him finish. "What's the plan?" I asked, gripping the flare tightly in my hand, my palms slick with cold sweat. "Disrupt the spiral," he said. "Stop the connection before they complete the ritual. It's the only way." The figures chanting grew louder, and I could feel the vibrations in my chest, deep and resonant. I thought of Ellie's warnings, her trembling voice as she spoke of the lake's hunger, its refusal to forgive. My pulse quickened as Elliot lit his flare, its harsh red light cutting through the gloom like an open wound. The first figure turned, their glowing eyes fixed on us. The others followed, their movements sharp and unnatural, as if controlled by strings invisible to the naked eye. They began advancing toward us, their chants growing louder, more chaotic. Elliot threw the flare onto the spiral, its light merging with the crimson glow beneath the ice. The markings seemed to ripple, twisting and writhing like living things as the flare's heat began to fracture their pattern. The figures lunged forward, their movements jerky and uneven, like marionettes fighting against their strings. One of them reached for Elliot, their gloved hand curling like talons. He swung his flashlight, connecting with their hooded face with a sickening crack. They stumbled but didn't fall, their glowing eyes burning brighter as they lunged again. I lit my flare and held it out in front of me, the sudden burst of light forcing them to recoil. "Keep moving," Elliot shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me closer to the spiral. The ice groaned beneath our weight, the cracks spreading like lightning. The figures were relentless, their movements growing more desperate as they tried to stop us. The spiral pulsed violently now, its crimson light so bright it seemed to bleed into the sky. I could feel the air shifting around us, heavy and oppressive, as though the lake itself was rising to meet us. Elliot grabbed the bundle of explosives from his bag, his hand steady despite the chaos surrounding us. "Cover me," he said, his voice firm but urgent. I nodded, raising my flare higher as another figure lunged toward us. Their hands were clawed now, their hood slipping just enough to reveal a twisted face, one that was barely human. My stomach churned as I swung the flare, forcing them back. Elliot set the explosives around the spiral's edges, his movements quick and precise. The ice groaned louder, its fractured surface trembling as the markings pulsed with unnatural energy. The figures grew more frantic, their glowing eyes flickering as they advanced again and again. The chanting stopped. I froze, the sudden silence more terrifying than the guttural sounds had been. The figures stood still, their movements halted, their glowing eyes fixed on the spiral. I turned to Elliot, his face pale but resolute as he prepared to ignite the explosives. Then, from beneath the ice, I heard it, a low, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. The figures fell to their knees, their hands clawing at the ice as though begging for mercy. The spiral pulsed one last time, its crimson light exploding into a blinding brilliance that forced me to shield my eyes. When I opened them, the ice was cracking, shattering beneath us in massive chunks that sank into the dark water below. Elliot grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the shore as the fissures spread faster than I could move on my own. The roar grew louder, a sound so primal and terrifying it felt like it was coming from within me. We reached the shore just as the ice gave way completely. The figures disappeared beneath the surface, their glowing eyes fading into the depths. The spiral shattered, its crimson light extinguished in a final, violent burst. The lake was silent again. Its surface rippled faintly, but there was no sign of the spiral, the figures, or the thing that had roared beneath the ice. The oppressive weight that had hung over Coldwater seemed to lift, and for the first time since we arrived, I felt like I could breathe. Elliot stood beside me, his flashlight trembling faintly in his hand. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp and focused, but I could see the exhaustion etched into his features. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He stared out at the lake, its surface calm but dark, as though waiting. Finally, he said, "For now." The walk back to the car was silent, but the air felt different, lighter, though not entirely free of the lake's presence. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching us from the trees. But the shadows remained still, their twisted forms swaying gently in the wind. As we reached the car and climbed in, I glanced at Elliot, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "You think it'll come back?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He didn't look at me, his focus unwavering. "The lake never gives back," he said. "It only waits." We drove away from Coldwater in silence, the town fading into the darkness behind us. The storm had stopped completely, leaving the landscape eerily still. As the moonlight reflected off the snow-covered fields, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was watching us, its hunger eternal. And though we were miles away by the time the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, I knew the lake would never let us go.